Imagine standing in the freezing mud, watching your own flesh and blood haggle over your life like you were nothing more than a sack of feed. For Ilara, the price of her freedom and her future was exactly one dairy cow. At 19 years old, she was traded away by a cruel stepfather to a silent, scar-faced mountain man named Silas Thorne. She expected a life of misery, a prison in the high peaks of the Colorado Rockies. But what she found in that isolated cabin wasn't a jailer. It was a love so fierce it would challenge outlaws, survive winter storms, and heal wounds that no doctor could touch. This is the story of how a girl sold for livestock became the queen of the mountain. This is your narrator, Marcus, from Frontier Rescue Stories. If you love tales of the Old West, of survival, redemption, rugged justice, and romance that blooms against all odds, you have come to the right place. Before we dive into this journey, do me a huge favor. Hit that like button, share this video, and smash subscribe. Your support helps us stir up the algorithm and bring these campfire tales to a larger audience. Also, I love hearing from you, so drop a comment down below and let me know which part of the world you are tuning in from today. Alright, settle in, because this one is a wild ride. Let's get into the story. The iron rims of the wagon wheels ground against the granite stones of the trail, a harsh grating sound that echoed through the vast emptiness of the high Sierras. The sun was already dipping below the jagged peaks, painting the sky in bruises of purple and charcoal, signaling the end of another day in the unforgiving West. The air up here was thin and sharp, smelling of pine needles and impending snow, a scent that usually meant danger to those who didn't know the land. Sitting on the buckboard of the rickety cart was Jebediah Crouch, a man whose soul was as twisted as the roots of an old oak tree. He hunched over the reins, his eyes darting around with a mixture of greed and desperation. Beside him sat Ilara Vance. She was 19 years old, but her eyes held the weariness of a woman 3 times her age. She clutched a tattered satchel to her chest, her knuckles white, staring down at her boots. Because she had learned long ago that making eye contact only invited trouble, she didn't cry. Tears were a luxury she couldn't afford, and they had dried up years ago, replaced by a cold, numb acceptance of her fate. The wagon lurched to a halt in front of a solitary cabin nestled against a sheer rock face. It was a sturdy structure, built from heavy timber logs that had withstood decades of mountain storms. From the shadows of the porch, a figure emerged. Silas Thorne was a mountain of a man, broad-shouldered and imposing, with a face that looked like it had been carved from the very granite of the Rockies. A scar ran down his cheek, disappearing into a beard that was flecked with the gray of hard winters. He moved with the silent, predatory grace of a cougar, a man clearly more comfortable with the wilderness than with people. Jebediah scrambled down from the wagon, plastering a slick salesman's grin on his face, the kind of smile that hid a mouthful of lies. "Evening, Mr. Thorne," he called out, his voice overly loud in the quiet clearing. "I brought the payment we discussed." Silas didn't smile back. His storm-gray eyes flicked to the back of the wagon, where a spotted dairy cow was tethered. The animal looked nervous, shifting its weight, sensing the tension in the air. Silas walked over, inspecting the animal with a practiced eye. "She's good stock," Jebediah hurried to say, patting the cow's flank. "Give you milk all winter. Worth every penny of the debt." "The cow will do," Silas rumbled, his voice deep and rough like gravel sliding down a chute. Then his gaze lifted. He looked past the animal, straight at Ilara. She shrank under his scrutiny, her shoulders hunching as if she expected a blow. "And the girl?" Silas asked. It wasn't a threat. It was a question heavy with a strange kind of sorrow. Jebediah waved a dismissive hand, as if he were swatting away a fly. "My stepdaughter." "Useless thing, slow in the head and clumsy with a needle," he lied smoothly. "She'll clean your floors and cook your stew. I'm done feeding an extra mouth that offers nothing in return. The cow for the girl, Thorne." That was the deal. The air grew heavy. Silas looked from the greasy, desperate man to the silent girl freezing on the wagon seat. He saw the patches on her dress, the raw red of her work-worn hands, and the terror she was trying so hard to hide. Slowly, deliberately, Silas reached into his coat and handed over the lead rope of the cow he had prepared for trade. "Take the cow. She's yours," Silas said, his tone final. Jebediah didn't waste a second. He grabbed the rope, tipped his hat with a mocking sneer, and climbed back onto his wagon. "Pleasure doing business, Stone. She's quiet. Too quiet, if you ask me." With a crack of the reins, he drove off, leaving Ilara standing in the dust, traded away for livestock like she was nothing more than a sack of grain. Silence stretched between them, vast and terrifying. Ilara finally looked up, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Silas watched the wagon disappear, then turned to her. "Come inside. It's freezing out here." She followed him, her legs trembling. The cabin was simple but immaculately clean. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting a warm orange glow that felt alien to her. Silas pointed to a bucket in the corner. "Water's there. There's stew on the stove if you're hungry." Ilara stood by the door, clutching her bag, waiting for orders, waiting for the cruelty she was used to. Silas poured himself a tin cup of coffee and sat heavily at the table. He looked at her, really looked at her, and sighed. "I didn't ask for this," he muttered, mostly to himself. "I needed a cow, not a servant. But what's done is done." "What's your name, girl?" "Ilara," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Ilara Vance." "Ilara," he tested the name, nodding slowly. "Listen to me, Ilara. You can stay here as long as you earn your keep. But get one thing straight, I don't keep prisoners. The door is unlocked." The words were plain, spoken without softness, but they loosened the tight knot of fear in her chest. He wasn't locking her in. "Yes, sir," she murmured. "Name's Silas," he corrected her gently. "Don't call me sir." That first night, lying on a narrow cot in a small side room, Ilara listened to the wind howling through the valley. She could hear Silas moving in the main room, the clink of his cup, the creak of his chair. She thought about her stepfather, miles away by now, and the cow that had bought her freedom. It was a cruel joke, a trade that should have crushed her spirit completely. But as she pulled the blanket up, a blanket that smelled of cedar and wood smoke, she realized something. No one had yelled at her. No one had raised a hand. For the first time in her life, she closed her eyes without fear. A single tear escaped, sliding down her cheek into the pillow. It wasn't from sadness. It was from overwhelming, terrifying shock of safety. The days that followed fell into a quiet rhythm. Silas was up before the sun, tending to his traps and the horses. Ilara followed his lead, trying to make herself useful, terrified that if she stopped working, he would realize she wasn't worth the cow and send her back. She learned to read his silence. It wasn't the angry silence of her stepfather. It was the quiet of a man who had lived alone too long. One afternoon, she was struggling to haul a heavy water bucket from the creek. Her arms burned, and her boots slipped in the mud. Suddenly, the weight vanished. Silas was there, lifting the bucket with one hand as if it were filled with feathers. He poured half of it out and handed it back. "Don't break your back trying to prove something I never asked of you," he grunted. He walked away before she could say thank you, leaving her stunned by the small, gruff act of kindness. A few days later, while sweeping the tool shed, she found it. Hidden in a corner, covered in dust, was a small wooden carving of a bear. It was beautiful, charred slightly at the edges, but carved with immense care and love. She was tracing the curve of the wood when a shadow fell over her. Silas stood in the doorway, his face unreadable. I'm sorry," she stammered, quickly putting it down. "I didn't mean to pry." "It's fine," he interrupted, his voice low. He stepped in and looked at the carving. "My boy made that, Toby. He was 8 years old." The silence that followed was heavy with ghosts. Ilara looked at the big, stoic man and suddenly understood the emptiness in his eyes. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." "Most folks don't know," he said, turning away. But the wall between them had cracked, just a little. That evening, as the fire popped and hissed, Ilara sat in the corner with a needle and thread. She had noticed a tear in the shoulder of Silas's heavy canvas coat. Her fingers, which her stepfather had called useless, moved with careful precision. When Silas came in from the cold, he stopped, seeing his coat mended and folded neatly on the table. He looked at the coat, then at her. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," Ilara replied softly. For the first time, a flicker of warmth crossed his eyes. He nodded, a simple gesture of thanks, and went to his room. Ilara sat back, a strange feeling blooming in her chest. She wasn't just a girl traded for a cow anymore. She was seen. And for a girl who had been invisible her whole life, that was a dangerous, wonderful thing. The morning sun didn't just rise in the high country. It shattered the darkness, spilling gold across the snow-capped peaks of the Sawtooth Ridge. Mist clung to the valleys, below like a heavy blanket, swirling with the spirits of the old frontier. Elara stepped out onto the porch, clutching her shawl tight against the biting chill of dawn. She had been at the cabin for nearly a month, now long enough to learn the rhythm of Silas. Thorn's days, but barely long enough to understand the man himself. He was like the mountain he lived on, hard, immovable, and full of things hidden deep beneath the surface. Some mornings she'd catch him staring at the horizon, his jaw set like iron, his eyes carrying a weight that bowed his broad shoulders. Other times she'd hear him murmuring to the horses in the lean-to, his voice gentler than it ever was with people. It was a low, rumbling baritone that seemed to settle the nervous animals. Elara had taken to feeding the livestock first thing. It was easier than trying to fill the silence over breakfast inside the cabin. She liked the warm, sweet smell of the horses, the way their breath plumed in the cold air. They didn't judge her. They didn't ask why a 19-year-old girl had been traded for a dairy cow. They simply nudged her palms for oats and offered a quiet companionship she hadn't known. She was starving for. One morning, after a breakfast of hardtack and black, coffee that could strip the varnish off a deck, Silas hitched up the sled to his old mare, Rusty. "We're heading to the North Ridge," he announced, pulling on his leather gloves. "Fence line is down. Elk probably smashed it. I could use an extra pair of hands." He looked at her then, really looked at her, as if testing her resolve. "It's a long ride, and the work is hard. You sure you're up for it?" Elara met his gaze, her chin lifting just a fraction. "I'm sure." The ride out was quiet. The only sounds the crunch of the sled, runners on the frost and the wind, sighing through the pines. When they reached the ridge, the work was grueling. Silas didn't treat her like a porcelain doll. He handed her the heavy cedar posts and expected her to hold them steady while he drove them into the rocky earth. Her arms shook and her muscles burned, but she didn't complain. She clamped her teeth together and held on. When they broke for water, sitting on a fallen log, Elara wiped sweat and dirt from her brow. Silas handed her his canteen. "Drink," he commanded gently. She took a sip, the water cool and sweet. "You don't talk much, do you?" she ventured, the question slipping out before she could stop it. Silas looked out over the valley. "Talking doesn't mend fences," he deadpanned. Then, after a long pause, he added, "Most folks say too much and mean too little. Words are cheap in the towns. Out here you save them for when they matter." Elara smiled, a small tentative thing. "And you? Do you mean what you say?" He adjusted his hat, shading his eyes. That evening, a rider appeared on the trail, a rare sight this high up. It was an older woman with skin like tanned leather and eyes that were sharp but kind. She introduced herself as Hattie, a midwife and healer who roamed the territories. "So the rumors are true," Hattie said, leaning on her saddle horn. "Jebediah's girl ended up with the hermit of Sawtooth Ridge." Elara flinched at the mention of her stepfather. "He traded me," she said quietly, "for a cow." Hattie's expression softened into something fierce. "That man has a soul blacker than coal oil. But listen to me, child. Don't you let that trade define your worth. You ain't a ledger entry, you're a person. And Silas, well, he's a hard nut to crack, but the man has a good heart buried under all that scar tissue." Before Hattie rode on, she leaned in closer. "He lost his kin to a fire 5 years back, wife and a little boy. That's why the house is so quiet. Just remember that when the silence gets loud." The revelation hit Elara hard. That night, she found herself standing by the corral under a sky bruised with stars. The dairy cow, the one she had been traded for, was grazing on a patch of dry grass. Elara ran her hand along the animal's spine. "Guess we're both stuck here," she whispered to the beast. "Traded and lost. Her name is Pearl." Elara jumped. Silas was standing on the porch, his silhouette framed by the lantern light from the doorway. He walked down the steps slowly. "Pearl?" Elara repeated. "My wife named her," Silas said, his voice thick. "She loved this cow. Said she was a better listener than me most days." Elara looked from the man to the cow. "Then maybe she'll listen to me, too." Silas didn't reply, just nodded once and turned back to the warmth of the cabin. But in that moment, the air between them shifted. It wasn't just two strangers coexisting anymore. It was two broken people navigating the wreckage of their pasts. A week later, the weather turned. It wasn't a slow change. It was a violent ambush. The sky turned a sickly green, and thunder cracked like a whip across the canyon walls. Rain fell in sheets, cold and heavy, turning the ground into a treacherous slurry of mud. Alara woke to the sound of the cabin groaning under the assault. She saw the front door banging open in the wind and realized Silas was gone. Panic, sharp and irrational, spiked in her chest. She saw a lantern swinging wildly out by the barn and heard a shout snatched away by the gale. Without thinking, she grabbed her shawl and ran out into the deluge. "Silas!" she screamed, her voice swallowed by the thunder. The mud sucked at her boots, trying to drag her down. She was terrified, not for herself, but that the only person who had treated her with dignity was in danger. She saw the barn door flapping and scrambled toward it. But the ground near the entrance was slick as oil. Her foot slipped and she went down hard, her knee slamming into a rock. Pain exploded up her leg, blinding and hot. She cried out, lying in the freezing mud, the rain plastering her hair to her face. Suddenly, strong hands were on her. Silas was there, lifting her from the muck as if she weighed nothing. "Fool girl!" He roared over the wind, his face inches from hers. "You trying to freeze to death?" He carried her into the barn, kicking the door shut against the storm. The sudden silence was deafening. The horses stamped nervously in their stalls. Silas set her down on a pile of hay, his chest heaving. He was soaked to the bone, water dripping from his beard. I thought you were hurt," Alara stammered, shivering violently. The door was open. "I couldn't find you." Silas stared at her, his anger draining away to reveal naked fear. He stripped off his heavy, wet coat and wrapped it around her shoulders, tucking it tight. His hands were rough, calloused, but incredibly warm. "I told you," he muttered, crouching before her. "This mountain isn't kind to people who care too much." "And yet," Alara whispered, looking into his storm-gray eyes, "you still care." Silas opened his mouth to argue, but the words died in his throat. Lightning flashed through the cracks in the wood, illuminating the space between them. For the first time, he didn't look away. He reached out, his hand hovering for a second before brushing a wet strand of hair from her forehead. It was a tentative, terrified gesture, but it shouted louder than any words he could have spoken. They sat there in the hay, the storm raging outside, but in that small, dry circle of lantern light, Alara Vance knew she had finally found something worth more than any trade. She had found a protector. The storm broke just before dawn, leaving the world washed clean and glistening under a pale winter sun. Inside the barn, the air was thick with the scent of damp hay and horses. Alara woke first, her head resting awkwardly against a grain sack. Silas's heavy coat still draped over her like a protective shell. Silas was already up, checking the hooves of the mare, Rusty, but his movements were slower than usual, less guarded. When he noticed her stirring, he didn't bark orders or retreat into his usual stony silence. Instead, he offered her a canteen of fresh water and a look that, for the first time, held no walls. "You should head inside," he said, his voice rough with morning sleep but lacking its former edge. "Change out of those wet clothes before the fever takes hold." Alara stood, her legs stiff, and handed him back his coat. "Thank you, Silas, for finding me." He paused, his hand brushing hers as he took the garment. Didn't see much point in letting good help freeze. He grumbled, but the corner of his mouth twitched, betraying him. It was the closest thing to a smile she had ever seen on his face. In the weeks that followed, the silence in the cabin changed. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating quiet of two strangers trapping themselves indoors. It was a comfortable, companionable peace. Alara began to hum while she kneaded dough for biscuits, old folk, tunes her mother used to sing before the hard times came. At first she worried Silas would silence her, but one evening, while he was oiling his rifle by the fire, he simply tapped his foot to the rhythm. She noticed the small changes too, the way he started carving again, not just simple repairs, but intricate figures. One evening, she found a new carving on the windowsill, a delicate cedar bluebird. When she asked him about it, he didn't turn away. "My wife loved the birds in spring," he said softly, staring into the flames. "Used to say they were the only things that sang without asking for payment." "She sounds wonderful," Alara said, daring to step closer to his grief. "She was," Silas replied, his voice cracking like dry wood. "Better than I deserved. The fire took them both fast. I couldn't get to them in time." "You're not alone now, Silas," she whispered. He looked at her, the firelight dancing in his haunted eyes. "I know. But peace in the frontier is often just a deep breath before the plunge." 3 weeks later, Alara was hanging laundry on the line, the crisp mountain breeze tugging at the sheets. when she saw a cloud of dust rising on the trail. Her stomach dropped. She knew that ride. She knew the slouch of the man in the saddle. It was Jebediah Crouch. He rode up to the fence line, his horse lathered and blowing hard. He didn't look like a man coming for a friendly visit. He looked like a vulture circling a carcass. He dismounted with a groan, spitting a stream of brown tobacco juice onto the clean snow near Alara's boots. "Well now," Jebediah drawled, his eyes raking over her with a sneer. "Ain't you looking well fed? Living high on the hog with your mountain man? I figured you'd have run off or died by now." Alara gripped the wet sheet in her hands, her knuckles turning white. "What do you want, Jebediah? We have nothing for you." "I want what's mine," he spat, stepping closer. The stench of stale whiskey and unwashed skin rolled off him in waves. "I've been thinking on our trade. Seems I let you go too cheap. A cow is fine for a season, but winter is long, and I've got debts calling. I reckon you ought to come back with me. I can get a better price for you down in the mining camps." Terror, cold and sharp, pierced Alara's heart. "You traded me," she said, her voice trembling but gaining strength. "A deal is a deal. I'm your kin," Jebediah roared, reaching for her arm. "Paper says I'm your guardian, and blood says you're Crouch property till I say otherwise." Before his fingers could close around her wrist, the cabin door slammed open. The sound was like a gunshot. Silas stood on the porch, and he looked terrifying. He wasn't the gentleman who carved birds anymore. He was pure granite and wrath. "Take your hand off her," Silas said. His voice was low, barely a whisper, but it carried across the yard with the weight of a rock slide. Jebediah froze, then slowly lowered his hand, a greasy smirk returning to his lips. "Now, Stone, no need to get riled. Just discussing family matters. You've had your fun with the girl. I'm just here to collect my property." Silas walked down the steps, one heavy boot at a time. He didn't stop until he was inches from Jebediah's face, towering over the smaller man. "She ain't property. And she sure as hell ain't your kin. Kin protects their own. You sold her." "Maybe I should have asked for 2 cows. Jebediah sneered, looking past Silas to wink at Alara. "Or maybe I'll just take her back and sell her to the brothel in Deadwood. They pay in gold, not livestock." The punch happened so fast Alara almost missed it. One moment Jebediah was grinning. The next, there was a sickening crunch of bone against bone, and he was sprawling in the dirt, clutching a broken jaw. Silas stood over him, his fist still clenched, his chest heaving. "Next time you speak of her like that," Silas growled, "you won't be walking away." Jebediah scrambled backward, spitting blood and a broken tooth into the dust. He looked at Silas with eyes full of pure, venomous hate. "You think you're a big man, Stone?" He lisped through the blood. "You don't know who I ride with now. I got friends, bad men, and I got debts that need paying. This ain't over." He dragged himself onto his horse, swaying in the saddle. "I'll be back," he screamed, wheeling the horse around. "And I'll burn this whole place to the ground with you inside it." He galloped away, leaving a trail of blood and threats hanging in the cold mountain air. That night, Alara found Silas sitting on the porch steps, a bottle of whiskey beside him that remained untouched. The moon washed the valley in silver, making the shadows look like ghosts. She sat down beside him, not touching him, just sharing the space. "He'll come back," Alara said quietly. It wasn't a question. "I know," Silas replied, his voice heavy. "Men like him, pride is a disease. He can't let it go." "You shouldn't have hit him," she whispered, though her heart swelled with gratitude that he had. Now he has an excuse. Silas turned to look at her, the moonlight catching the scar on his cheek. "I don't regret it. Some things need saying with fists when words won't carry the weight." He looked at his hands, calloused and scarred. "I told you, Alara, trouble follows folks like us." Alara reached out and, for the first time, took his hand in hers. His skin was rough, but his grip was gentle as he turned his palm to hold hers. "I'm not afraid of trouble, Silas. Not anymore." "You should be," he warned, though he didn't pull away. "I was afraid when I was alone," she said, looking him in the eye. "But you said it yourself. You haven't been alone since the night I came here." Silas stared at her, and the walls around his heart crumbled just a little more. "No," he admitted softly. "I haven't." The wind howled through the pines, sounding like a warning of the storm to come. But on that porch, hand in hand, they made a silent pact. Jebediah Crouch would bring war to their doorstep. They knew that for certain, But he would find that the girl he sold and the man he mocked were no longer easy prey. They were a family, forged in the fires of hardship, and they would defend this mountain with everything they had. The days that followed Jebediah's threat were quieter, but the silence carried a strange weight. Like the heavy, static air before a hailstorm, the peace of the cabin had been fractured. Ilara noticed the way Silas checked the fence lines twice a day now. His Winchester rifle always slung over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the tree line for movement. He didn't sleep much anymore either. Every night when Ilara stirred awake, she would find him sitting by the window in the dark, the moonlight glinting off the barrel of his gun, watching shadows that might never come. 10 days later, the fear took form. Silas had ridden down the canyon to check the lower traps, leaving Ilara alone at the homestead. The sun was dipping low, casting long, copper-red shadows across the yard. When she heard it, the heavy thud of hooves, not one horse but 3, her breath hitched in her throat. She stepped onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Jebediah Crouch was back, and he hadn't come alone. 2 men rode beside him, rough-faced hired guns with dust on their coats and cruelty in their eyes. Jebediah dismounted first, a bandage wrapped around his jaw where Silas had broken it. His grin twisted and mean. "Well, look at that," he drawled, the words slurring slightly through his injury. "Still playing house? I see the mountain man ain't around to hide behind today." Ilara stood tall, forcing her legs not to tremble. "He's close enough," she lied, though her voice shook. "You have no business here, Jebediah." "I got every right," Jebediah shouted, his face flushing red. "You were sold, Ilara." "Not gifted. I'm here to collect what's owed to me." He signaled to his men, who cocked their rifles with a menacing clack-clack that echoed in the valley. "Grab her," Jebediah ordered, "and burn the cabin." Ilara backed up against the door, her hand fumbling for the latch. But before the hired guns could spur their horses forward, a sound cut through the air, the unmistakable, metallic click of a double-barreled shotgun. "The only thing you'll collect here is lead, Crouch," a deep voice rumbled. Silas stepped out from the dense pine line to the east. He hadn't gone to the traps at all. He had been watching, waiting. He walked forward steadily, the shotgun leveled, his eyes hard as flint. "3 against 1, Stone?" Jebediah sneered, though his horse danced nervously beneath him. "That ain't much of a bargain for you." "I faced worse odds," Silas said calmly. The tension snapped like a dry twig. One of the hired men twitched toward his holster, but he was too slow. Silas fired. The blast shattered the afternoon stillness, sending the man sprawling into the dirt as his horse reared and bolted. The second outlaw cursed, firing wildly as he wheeled his horse around, bullets splintering the wood of the porch railing inches from Ilara's face. Silas didn't flinch. He racked the next shell and fired again, clipping Jebediah's shoulder. The old man screamed, clutching his arm as he nearly fell from his saddle. "It's over!" Silas roared, walking through the gun smoke like a vengeance spirit. "Get off my land!" Jebediah, bleeding and panicked, glared at them with feverish hatred. "You think she's yours?" He spat, blood seeping through his fingers. "You think love changes what she is? She's a Crouch by blood. You'll never outrun it." But the barrel of Silas's gun didn't waver. With a final, hate-filled curse, Jebediah turned his horse and galloped after his fleeing companion, leaving the dead man and a trail of blood in the dust. Silas didn't chase them. He dropped the gun and rushed to the porch, grabbing Ilara by the shoulders. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his eyes scanning her frantically. "No," she breathed, shaking her head. "Silas, you could have died." "So could you," he murmured, pulling her into his chest. And in that moment, with the smell of gunpowder and pine surrounding them, something inside Ilara broke, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of being loved this much. They held each other, 2 broken souls who had defended their home against the world. Weeks passed. The snow began to fall, light at first, then heavy, blanketing the violence of that day in pristine white. Life slipped back into a rhythm, but something new was stirring within Ilara. One morning, while carrying firewood, the world tilted on its axis, and she felt a wave of dizziness so strong she had to sit in the snow. When she missed her second cycle, the truth hit her like a sunrise over the peaks. She waited until evening to tell him. Silas was carving by the fire, the light playing across his scarred features. "Silas, she said softly, her hand resting on her stomach. "There's something you should know." He looked up, brow furrowed. "What is it? Is it Jebediah?" "No," she smiled, tears filling her eyes. "It's a child. Yours." The piece of wood dropped from his hands. He stared at her, stunned, as if she had just told him the sun had decided to rise in the west. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." He stood slowly, his rough hands trembling as he reached out to cup her face. He kissed her then, soft and desperate, as if he was breathing for the first time in years. "I never thought I'd have another chance," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Neither did I," she replied. "But peace is a fragile thing in the West." As spring approached and the snowmelt turned the rivers into raging torrents, Hattie rode up the mountain trail again. Her face was grim. "Silas," she said, not bothering to dismount, "you need to know. Jebediah has been seen near Granite Falls. Folks say he's gathering men, a real posse this time. He's telling anyone who will listen that you stole his girl and his gold." Alara stood in the doorway, her hand instinctively covering the small bump of her belly. Silas's face hardened into stone. "Did he say when?" "Soon," Hattie warned. That night, Silas packed his saddlebags. He oiled the Winchester until it gleamed. Alara watched him from the table, her heart breaking. "You can't go," she whispered. "We can hide." Silas turned to her, his eyes gentle but resolute. "I'm not going to hide, Alara, and I won't wait for him to bring a war to this cabin, not with our child coming." He walked over and kissed her forehead, lingering there. "Lock the door. Keep the lamp low. I'll end this, and then we'll be free." "I can't lose you," she sobbed. "You won't," he promised. Silas Thorne rode out into the darkness, the forest swallowing him whole. Alara sat by the fire, listening to the rhythm of the flames, waiting for the sound of thunder that wasn't thunder. She knew that somewhere in the dark, the man who had bought her for a cow was riding to pay the ultimate price for their freedom. The hours dragged by like years, measured only by the rhythmic popping of the firewood and the frantic beating of Alara's heart. Sometime after midnight, a sound rolled down from the canyon, faint, distant, like dry branches snapping under a heavy boot. It was gunfire, a flurry of shots, then silence. A silence so heavy it felt like it might crush the cabin flat. Alara didn't sleep. She sat by the window, her hand resting on her stomach, praying to a god she hadn't spoken to in years. Morning arrived, gray and cold, the sun struggling to pierce the cloud cover. Alara was jolted from her daze by the sound of a wagon creaking into the yard. It wasn't Silas's horse. It was Sheriff Miller, a grim-faced lawman from Granite Falls, with Hattie riding beside him. Alara flew out the door, her knees nearly buckling. "Where is he?" she choked out. The sheriff took off his hat, twisting the brim in his hands. "He's alive, ma'am, but he's hurt bad. We got him down to Hattie's place. He lost a lot of blood before we found him." Alara didn't wait for permission. She climbed into the wagon, her face pale but set like flint. "Take me to him." The ride to Hattie's cabin was a blur of fear. When she burst into the back room, the smell of antiseptic and copper hit her. Silas lay on a narrow bed, his skin the color of ash. A thick bandage was wrapped around his side, stained dark red. But when he heard her footsteps, his eyes fluttered open. They were glassy with pain, but they focused on her instantly. "Alara," he rasped, his voice sounding like gravel grinding together. "You stubborn old fool," she wept, falling to her knees beside the bed and taking his hand. "You promised you wouldn't leave me." "Kept my promise," he whispered, a faint, pained smile touching his lips. "It's done. Jebediah won't ever bother you again." The sheriff stepped into the doorway behind her. "He's telling the truth, ma'am. Jebediah and his men tried to ambush Silas in the pass. They didn't count on him knowing that terrain better than the deer do. It's over. The debt is paid in full." Recovery was slow. The winter refused to let go, howling outside while Silas fought his own battle in the bed. Alara never left his side. She changed his bandages, fed him broth, and read to him while the wind rattled the panes. But Silas was made of the same tough stuff as the mountain. By the time the first green shoots of spring pushed through the melting snow, he was walking again, albeit with a limp he would carry for the rest of his days. Spring brought more than just wildflowers, it brought life. One warm afternoon, while Alara was kneading dough, a sharp pain radiated through her back, stopping her breath. She gripped the table, looking up to see Silas watching her, his eyes wide with a panic he had never shown in a gunfight. "It's time," she gasped. Silas rode for Hattie as if the devil himself were snapping at his heels. The labor was long and grueling, lasting through the night. But Silas stayed. The man who had faced down outlaws and survived avalanches sat by the bed, holding her hand, wiping sweat from her brow, whispering stories of the high country to anchor her through the pain. Just as the sun crested the peaks, painting the world in shades of apricot and gold, a cry pierced the air, high, strong, and undeniably alive. "It's a girl," Hattie announced, her voice thick with emotion, placing the tiny, squalling bundle into Alara's arms. Alara looked down at her daughter. She was perfect. 10 tiny fingers, a tuft of dark hair, and eyes that were already searching the world. She looked up at Silas, whose rugged, scarred face was wet with tears he made no effort to hide. "She's beautiful," he choked out, touching the baby's cheek with a trembling finger. "We'll name her Hope," Alara whispered, "because that's what she is. Proof that something good can grow from broken ground." Life on the mountain went on, but the shadows were gone. The cabin filled with new sounds, the cooing of a baby, creak of a rocking chair, and something that had been missing for too long: laughter. One evening, months later, they sat on porch watching the sunset. Little Hope was asleep in Alara's arms. The dairy cow, Pearl, the catalyst for it all, grazed peacefully in the pasture below. "You ever think about it?" Alara asked softly, leaning her head on Silas's shoulder. "How we started. A girl traded for a cow." The shame that used to accompany those words was gone, replaced by a sense of wonder at how far they had come. Silas chuckled, a deep, warm sound that rumbled in his chest. He wrapped his arm around her, pulling her and their daughter closer. "I reckon it was the best bargain I ever made." Alara laughed, looking out over the vast, wild beauty of their home. They had chosen each other when the world had given them no choice at all, and that, she realized, was the greatest freedom of all. And that, my friends, is where we leave Silas and Alara, safe, sound, and finally home. Love isn't always found in grand ballrooms. Sometimes it's forged in the mud, traded for a cow, and fought for with a Winchester rifle. If this story touched your heart, or if you just love a good ending where the good guys win, please smash that like button and subscribe to Frontier Rescue Stories. It helps me keep the campfire burning and brings more of these tales to you. Make sure to check out the channel playlist on your screen right now for more stories of survival and romance in the Wild West. We've got plenty more where this came from. I have a question for you all before you go. If you were in Alara's shoes, would you have forgiven Silas for the trade in the beginning, or would you have run? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, keep your powder dry and your fences mended. Best wishes to you and yours.